So are you a rule keeper or a rule breaker? Think about yourself for a moment. When it comes to rules and laws, do you find that you see them as really important, created and put in place to keep us and others safe and to make sure that things run well? Or do you instead find yourself wanting to break the rules, seeing them as restrictive and inhibiting? Of course, there's a spectrum, but I reckon we all have a tendency to either want to break the rules or to keep the rules. How you respond to that question might also indicate how you perceive the book of James. This week we are exploring verses 19 to 27. And you may remember last week that we explored how the letter was written about 45 AD and is addressed to the church, these 12 scattered tribes that had been flung across the Mediterranean because of the persecution in Jerusalem. James's letter is heavily influenced by the wisdom literature of the Old Testament and particularly the book of Proverbs, but it's also influenced by the teaching of Jesus and his Sermon on the Mount. And throughout his letter, we see references to that. The book of James is really practical, suggesting throughout that Christian faith in the gospel should work itself out in a life of obedience. In this first chapter that we started last week and we're finishing this morning, James offers a number of sound bites that he's going to explore in more detail later on in his book. And last week I offered 4 reasons for why I felt it was significant for us here at St. Gabriel's to be looking at this letter at this time. Do go back and have a look on the website if you missed it. As we come to our passage this morning, we come to the heart of what James is at pains to communicate throughout his letter. He's saying basically, don't just listen to the word, but do what it says. Just do it. And why? Well, he says in this passage, because if you follow this word, this perfect law, it brings freedom and it brings blessing. In 2006, Catherine and I, with Ethan and Izzy, went on a long-awaited trip to America for 3 weeks. I'd wanted to take Catherine since we got married. I'm half American and spent the second year of my university at North Carolina University there. It was an amazing 3 weeks as we travelled up the East Coast. And for the final 10 days, we were joined by my parents, and my dad took us to a large wooden house on the edge of a huge lake in New Hampshire. It is owned by my dad's cousins and has been in his family for many, many years. He remembers going as a child. The house has a jetty that goes out onto the water of the lake where you can dive off into the water and launch boats. Ethan, as you'll see in this picture, was still 3 and Isabella was 2 years old. So they both couldn't swim. Potentially then, this jetty could have been a real hazard and worry. And so what we wanted to do is we gave the kids 2 very simple rules. These rules they had to keep if they wanted to go out onto the jetty. So firstly, they had to be with an adult, and secondly, they had to wear a life vest, as they're doing in this picture. If they did so, they would be able to be safe and play on the jetty. They could run around, they could join me with fishing, as I'm doing there. They could get in the boats with us, they could even jump in the water if they wanted to. These 2 simple rules gave them freedom to enjoy themselves. Now, both kids were old enough to understand the rules, but particularly with Izzy, not old enough to understand why we had put these rules in place and why they were important to follow. But they did discover that if they followed these simple rules, they would have way more freedom and fun and wouldn't have to stay stuck back at the house and away from the water. James describes in verse 25 that Stuart read to us this morning, the law as perfect and it being able to bring freedom and blessing. Like our kids on the jetty, God gives us his perfect law because he knows that if we live it out, it will bring us, in fact, freedom and blessing. God says to us, if you follow these laws, if you live life as I've set it out, it will bring you so much joy and freedom than you ever thought possible. Now, we might not fully understand why he has put these laws in place. We may lack the maturity, but we follow them because we know that he is a good father who loves us completely and wants the best for us. He knows that through them we will experience blessing and joy in whatever circumstances of life. In Matthew 11, verses 28 to 30, Jesus says this, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Remember that we gave Ethan and Izzy 2 rules to make sure that they were with an adult and that they wore a life vest. Jesus says to us, like 2 oxen ploughing a field, yoke yourself to me. Let me walk and work with you to help you carry your burdens. But he also says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And Jesus here is referring to the yoke of the law that had been twisted and manipulated by the religious leaders at the time. The law had become a heavy burden, a load that, instead of bringing freedom and life, brought oppression, guilt, and shame. But the law of Jesus, the perfect law mentioned by James, is easy and light, and it helps us to live lightly and freely. So as you come to this letter of James, how are you going to respond to the challenges he puts forth? Do you perceive them as something good that will help us to live life in all its fullness, joy and freedom? Or are they things that you think are going to restrict you from doing what you really want to do? Surrounding verse 25, the perfect law that James describes, he suggests that we're going to experience this freedom and blessing that come from the perfect law. We must do 2 things. Firstly, we must be good receivers of the law, and secondly, we must be good doers. Let's explore that a bit more. James loves a good illustration, and one of his best is here in verse 23. While it takes me 300 words to share an illustration, James just uses 38, and he says this, "Do not merely listen to the words and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and, looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like." I love it. James is saying that if you hear and don't act, it's like you're looking yourself in the mirror, checking your appearance, checking out your hair, maybe checking your makeup's okay, checking there's no food in your beard. Okay, maybe that's just me. But then you walk away and 2 minutes later, you've completely forgotten what you look like. It's foolish. It's silly. It makes no sense. And it is a waste of time. But, he says, look intently into the perfect law. And the Greek word here that James uses, to look or to look intently, is different to the Greek word translated as look in verse 23 and 24. Now he's using this word parakupto, and it literally means to stoop, to peer in, and to look down in detail. To be a good receiver of the word requires us to first look in detail at it, to focus on God's law. We don't just listen in some passive way. We take action with our hearts and our minds to take hold of and receive what is being taught. The psalmist in Psalm 1 says that blessed is the one whose delight is in the law of the Lord and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season. James says in verse 21, humbly accept the word planted in you. Receive the word that is already within you. And so a good receiver doesn't just hear, but meditates and takes delight in the law. The word is like a seed, Jesus says in Luke 8, that if it falls on good soil, will produce a crop 100-fold. And so let the word become your spiritual food. It's our drink, it's our light, it's our lamp, it's our path. So how well do you receive it? How do we receive it well? Well, James suggests that it's through humility. It's not always thinking that we are right and have all the answers. It's being quick to listen. It's being ready to get rid of, literally putting off, throwing aside all the baggage and brokenness and filth of our lives. Instead, we clothe ourselves in Christ, receiving his mercy, grace, and forgiveness. And it's why confession in our services is nearly always before the Bible reading and talk. We need to get right before God to make us more able to receive the word that he has for us. I've preached regularly now for over 8 years. And before the pandemic, I would stand at the back of church at the end of services. And if I had preached, people would often say encouraging words, which I was always grateful to receive. But sometimes I would want to say, but fortunately never did, I don't care how nice you felt it was. What are you going to do about it? I realise that this is insensitive, but James has a similar sentiment here. Now you've received and heard, what are you going to do about it? And so secondly, we need to be good doers. The seed produces a crop. The impact of the receiving of the word is seen in the fruit that is produced. Interestingly, though, I do think this is a two-way thing. Sometimes we get better at receiving by first doing. So, for example, we tell our children to say please, to say thank you, to say sorry, etc. And we have taught them to do so even before they might know what those words really mean or can feel what those words mean when they say them. But we have, and we continue to encourage them to say that because it's in the action of saying please and thank you and sorry that we believe that the habit changes the heart. The habit changes the heart. So if you're struggling to be motivated to follow God's law, to get into his words, to receive his direction in your life through a whole host of different means, if that's you, if you're feeling like it's a bit pointless, maybe start doing it. And in doing so, your heart might be changed. Now, James is going to go into more detail in the rest of his letter. But for now, he gives a hint about what good doing looks like. James uses here 3 particular examples that we read in the passage. These are obviously not the only fruits of a life that is good at receiving and doing the word, and even not the most important. But he probably uses them because these fruits have a long pedigree in Old Testament teaching, and they seem to be a particular struggle for James's readers. So he says this: firstly, to be a good doer means to control your tongue. The Greek, again here, gives the impression of bridling, curbing, and restraining. In not doing so, it's like you are deceiving yourself of the righteousness and worthiness of your religion. Your speech is that important. It has the power to bless or to curse. Secondly, a good doer cares for, protects, and restores those who are most helpless and on the margins of society. In that time, it was the orphans and the widows. Today, It's the homeless, the jobless, those who are disadvantaged because of their race, their gender, their class. We need to be the ones who are caring for and protecting, restoring the least, the last, and the lost in our society. And thirdly, James says, it's keeping oneself from being polluted by the world. It's being in the world, but not of the world. And he's saying, don't go back to put on what you got rid of in verse 21. Guard yourself, stay close to Jesus, walk and work with him. In the coming weeks, James is going to be getting more practical and more challenging. But for now, I want to finish by asking this. How are you going to receive the teaching that is to come? My prayer is that we will experience it like a life vest that gives us protection. That means that we can run through this life with freedom, life, and joy, and share that with other people and encourage other people to join in us in this life. And that we will receive it as words from a loving Father who is walking and working with us and who wants us to thrive and to flourish. Amen.